everybody. Welcome back to Teens No Cap. My name is Chaffee. I'm your host for today. I'm a licensed mental health counselor specializing in the treatment of adolescents. High-risk adolescents are my people. And today you're joining us for part 2 with Dr. Emily Gordon talking about GLPs and in society. And I think today we're focused a little bit more on, as a parent, what do you do when you've made the decision to start a GLP, and how do you have some of those conversations with your teen? I know a lot of teens are already very sensitive to like their bodies and how we kind of view that in society. And so I think even if your teen isn't necessarily struggling with an eating disorder or disordered eating, it's still a really helpful conversation to have and something you're probably going to need to navigate. So Dr. Gordon, do you want to say hello and give us a quick intro?
Sure. I'm so excited to be back with you. I always love talking with you, and lots of good questions and insights. And so I am Emily Gordon. I'm a psychologist licensed in Massachusetts, Vermont, New York. New York is pending, sorry, Connecticut and Florida. And I work a lot with adolescents and young adults and parents and people navigating body image and eating disorders in the world.
Well, thank you so much for coming back. I always love chatting with you. I can very much appreciate that we have a similar interest, I think, clinically, and at the same time carry some different perspectives on how we would kind of help navigate these situations with the people we work with. So as we had talked about in our last episode, we know that GLPs are like a very strong presence at this point in our society, and there's a lot of people that are on them. And I think that a lot of what we had talked about last time is that there's lots of considerations that need to be had. Medical guidance, I think we can make decisions, but I think informed decisions are obviously the best we can do. And so we talked a lot about kind of history of GLPs and, kind of what goes into all of that. But today the focus was really on talking about like, how do you have some of those conversations, and what do you do once you've made the decision to start a GLP, especially if you're parenting a teenager? So do you have some initial thoughts on that? Because I also have some questions from the peanut gallery. But
I suppose I do have some thoughts that I can maybe just start us off with, and then maybe that will lead into the questions. So I think this is really tricky because what's always hard, like when I'm a podcast guest, right? And I imagine you find this too, is like we're kind of talking about these general, like, well, what do I think generally? And the difficulty is like, I don't know who's listening. You don't know who's listening. And I don't know that individual, and I don't know that particular kid. And so I think the caveat I always like to make when I ever say anything is like, you gotta really think about your own child and sort of what their psychology is and where they are developmentally and sort of what are the things. So this sort of dialectic is that parents are absolutely allowed to take care of themselves, to make their own health decisions or any other decisions. I remember we were deciding like to buy a new car, and like one of my kids was like didn't like the car choice, right? And it was like, okay, but we get to decide what car we're buying. So we absolutely have the ability and the right to sort of make our own decisions about our own health and well-being. And yet we have to know and understand that those decisions do not get made in a vacuum, and that despite our best intentions, they can impact our kids. And they impact, again, back to my first point, like they impact each kid differently depending on that child and where they are developmentally and what particular struggles they deal with and who else is in their life. So it's really hard. And I don't think we'll come to like a right answer, but I hope that we'll discuss some things to consider. I think there's like some general like frames as we are thinking about how do we like, what do we tell our kids? When do we tell our kids? How do we tell them? And sort of balancing, like, so just some things to keep in mind is like, what is the reason why you're sharing this information with your kid? Like, is that more about you? Is that more about them? And sort of making sure that you're doing it from a like from a way that sort of you're still the parent and you're still in charge. You're not looking for the emotional validation or like a permission from your kid. So I think that that's like one thing we can do. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about the way that like the words and the way that bodies get talked about and health gets talked about, like that we have to be really thoughtful of. Yeah, so I think those are like my initial thoughts.
I was gonna say, I think that when we're talking about this, obviously, like, you and I are not directly working potentially with like someone who is listening. And so these are always just like considerations for food for thought. I certainly like, I think when we talk on a more general level, it can be hard to kind of like apply it to specific situations, which is why if you're on a GLP and you haven't talked to your teen yet, that might be a great time to like get in with your own therapist and really talk about like how and when and why you'd want to do that, and really assure that like your teen might have support in that as well, and like how we talk about it, because obviously like Dr. Gordon and I, like, we have a wealth of information, and at the same time, like, we're not specific providers like for.
Well, I think that's a great suggestion because A, I think it would be really helpful for this conversation, and B, what we know about like GLP-1s and weight loss is that it does address one part of the sort of physical thing that's going on, but a lot of times when we're talking about food and bodies and weight, there's also a lot of emotional layers, and what we know is that medications don't address those underlying layers, right? And so probably therapists, we always think therapy is a good idea, but maybe therapy would also be helpful with some of the things that are going on that are sort of that are leading to or related from, the reason for being on the medication. And it's also a good reminder that like parents are people, and we have our own issues and our own blind spots and our own challenges and our own like life experiences, and we're not expected to be perfect and to not have those challenges, but the more support and help that we can get for ourselves, the better off we can feel and be in ourselves. And that is only good for our kids and our families.
Absolutely. I think too, it's committing to that, like, self-development and that like personal growth. And I know that a lot of people talk about therapy as more of a reactive situation where they're like, oh, I don't need that because nothing is wrong. But I also think, as someone who is very proactive in terms of treatment, is that we can engage in systems and learn something even if the world isn't on fire. And so if you're someone who's contemplating a GLP, or you're someone who maybe is already actively on one, it's never a bad time to engage with a therapist that can really help you see maybe some barriers for yourself or some areas where you could or would want to improve. I will die on the hill of everyone needs to be in therapy.
Me too.
That's my own thing.
It
But
doesn't have to be with me, right? Like it's not like yeah, but right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the first thing, and I actually, this happens a lot, I think, in my clinical practice because I focus mostly with the teens, is there are a lot of parents who are starting GLPs, and their first question to me is often, should I tell my teenager?
Well, yeah, I don't know how to answer should I or shouldn't I, but I just think of the things to think about, right? So one of the things that I think about in that circumstance is that you and I have probably not like talked about this before. Teenagers are really smart and they're really observant. And that sort of parenting adage, like do as I say, not as I do, like that doesn't really work because teens are so smart and so observant, and the way that they learn is actually by watching and by doing, not by listening. So why do I say that? I say that because if a parent is losing weight in for whatever reason and in whatever way, a teen is probably noticing, because I've had conversations where like I think people are noticing that many people around them are losing weight. Like it's sort of this phenomenon that's happening, right, with this rise in the increase of GLP-1 meds. So to assume that your kid isn't noticing and doesn't have an opinion and that it doesn't impact them, I think is maybe wishful thinking, but probably not what's actually happening. So I do think we have to address it somehow.
So I was going to say, I think that based on how I have seen GLPs work for people, and based on obviously the perception of teenagers and how kind of like acutely aware they are, that there should be a way and a rationale for addressing that with your teenager. Because I think that if it's left unaddressed, they're going to notice the difference in food intake. They're going to notice the weight loss. They're going to notice these other pieces. Their world is going to shift if you're not eating dinner with them anymore. And so it's better to have a preemptive conversation than to have a reactive conversation. Because again, teens worry. Even if they say they hate you, they still worry about you. And if they're noticing that you're dropping weight really quickly, or you're not eating as much, or like, there are some other impacts of GLPs on your physical, your fatigue, your energy levels, etc. We want to set the stage that this is why you're doing this. This is, what the purpose of it is. These are things you're editing in the why, so that they're not sitting there being like, does my mom have cancer? Is my dad dying? Like, why are they losing weight so drastically? Why don't they want to eat with me? Are they upset with me? And again, every parent, I get it. I want you to make your own decision. And I also think, like, when we think about the impacts, it's more of a spider web. So when you're thinking about like, how do I talk to my kid about this? I think it's really important to think about your specific kid in terms of like how sensitive they are, how aware they are, where their anxiety might go. And that is all that connection of like, how would my kid respond to this? But I also like, I wouldn't want a kid or a teenager to be really freaked out if like they're noticing these things, but they have no narrative for it.
Yeah, I think that those are such important points, right? And it reminds me of the conversation that we had the first time, right, about what are the potential side effects and sort of what does happen for some people when they start these medications, right? That it's not just the weight loss, it's all of the other sort of physical changes, some emotional changes, and certainly some physical potential like side effects. So yeah, I think it's important to speak to those. I think we've said, and we should reiterate, like, you do need to think about where your kid is at developmentally. And I think, when kids are younger and like we give them less information and more concrete, and as they get to be teens and into like middle to late teenagehood, maybe we give them even more or different information. So really thinking about where your kid is at developmentally. I think also it's really, really important, and it's hard to say. It's important to make it about health and not about like weight and appearance. But even as I say that, I hear myself in my other voice sort of saying, but weight doesn't equal health, and so it gets like really complicated. But I think it's important to make it about health as much as you can. And some people will say like less information is more. I don't know. I might actually say that the more specific you can be about the specific health reason, again, not that you have to give your kid all of the details, but that I think it would be helpful, because we don't want to be sending the message, like this sort of general message that I believe is out there in the culture, which I think leads to weight stigma and eating disorders, is that smaller bodies equal health. So this is I think a good example of how like nuanced and difficult this conversation and this topic is, and sort of teasing all of this out.
I also think too, though, when I think about a teen brain, they're obviously still developing. They're still trying to figure out kind of where things fall for them. And the thing that I would really want people to consider and think about is like, what narrative do you want your teen to have about this? And who do you want to give them that narrative? Because I do think sometimes like teens want information. They want to understand how you got there. They want to understand all those pieces. And if they have questions, I'd want them to be able to ask, because at the end of the day, we have so many AI models out there who are giving information. The internet is a click away, right? There's lots of false information. There's lots of clickbait. There's lots of stuff that's out there. And so if you're considering having this conversation with your teenager, I'd want you to think about like, what narrative do I actually want them to have?
Yeah. Having some thoughtfulness and some input and some control over that narrative, and being mindful to not make it about like body dissatisfaction and appearance, but making it more about other factors. I think that's a really good point for another reason too, which is that, like it or not, and this is the reason I think we're having this conversation, is that these medications are out there in the culture. And whether, we're talking about what to do when parents make this decision and how do they talk about it with their teens, but there's also an increase in teens taking these medications, sometimes in communication with their parents and caregivers, and sometimes not. And so, I think the people in my house are ready to, like, they're so they've heard enough of me. But I was sitting here last night trying to think about this conversation, and I kid you not, in the span of 45 minutes, there were three advertisements on the TV, for the various GLP-1s. I was sitting with a flyer on my counter that is a marketing flyer that says, "This isn't a diet, it's a movement." And I have no idea, as I think none of us do, what it is that our kids are encountering online and in their digital world. And so I think that's a really good point, that we have to assume they are seeing these things. If you remember, we all sat down, maybe you watched the Super Bowl, maybe you didn't, right? But there were a couple of ads during the Super Bowl, right? Like the ads last night were during a basketball game, or whatever sporting event was on the TV. So I think our kids are seeing these things. And again, the more we can talk with them and share how we are thinking and how we are processing, and help them and ask, what do they think, and do they have questions, and what is this like for them? I think that's really important.
Well, and I think the other part of it, and you had brought this up, which I think is so critical for teens, is that they're more astute, and they're following what you do and what your choices are rather than what you're saying. And so I think the hard part with GLPs is they're seeing you potentially take a GLP. Again, we're not shaming or blaming that. Like, that is a choice for lots of different reasons. But I think what I have seen a lot of is that when parents are taking it, the kids are like, okay, I want the GLP too. And so I think that there are definitely considerations for that as well. But I think that follows that kind of like, do as I do, not so much as I say. Because even if you're having the conversation about like why you're doing it and your health issues and like anything else coming up, you likely will have a teenager who's like, well, I want to lose weight too, and I want the GLP.
So I think, yeah, I mean, yes. I think that's actually an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for a couple of reasons. One is that, as we touched on last time, one of my big concerns about these medicines is, particularly in adolescents, as we are seeing increased numbers of teens, is that you mentioned teen brains, right? Teen brains and teen bodies are still under development. And so the risks of taking these medications for somebody who is still developing is much different than the risk of taking these medicines when you are in a fully developed body and brain. That doesn't mean there aren't risks. It just means like the risks are different. And so I think that is a really important conversation to be had, about, look, it's just like life isn't fair sometimes, right? Like it's different when you're an adult versus when you're when you're a teenager. Lots of things are different when you're an adult, like, bedtime, alcohol, like things are like, we make different decisions based on what's going on in our bodies and our brains, and that's really important. So I think that's one opportunity to have that discussion. I think that the part that we can't ignore here is, like, we all are living in this culture that we're in. And we're all experiencing the messages and the trauma and the pain that can come from being in a body that is not perceived as acceptable or okay. And part of what we as parents, I think, want to do is like help our kids navigate these messages that are coming at them, and sort of how to feel okay about themselves or in their bodies for who they are, even when they are in this culture that is like telling them to change and telling them that they're not okay and telling them that they need to fix something. And that's something that we can talk with our kids about, like how we navigate that, how we contend with those messages. And, I don't know about like the teens in my practice, the teens in my life, like when you give them a problem, their solutions and their creative ideas are like they probably have ideas and they've probably done things and they might even teach you something. But being able to like almost sort of like join together, right? And tackle that together, I think can be really like that can be an opportunity.
Absolutely. And I love that you framed it that way because I do think that like a lot of these conversations aren't just hey, I'm giving you this information and it's done. It's really opening this opportunity to have some deeper discussions around body image, about self-esteem, about like culture and society and all that stuff. And like if we think about the fact that if you surveyed, 1,000 people, how many of those people would say that they are perfectly happy in their body, that there's nothing that they would want to change, that everything is fine, right? You might have some, but I think that that's a smaller percentage of people that are like, I want a nose job, I want to have a tummy tuck, I want to have like facial surgery or whatever, right? So when we think about bodies, I think there also is this space where it's like, well, you should just be happy with the body you have. Instead of talking about like, what are the specifics that you're uncomfortable with and how do those translate into society for you? And what does that mean for you, right? Long term. And then are there things you can do about that that would make you more comfortable, more confident, whatever? And like, we have to also contend with the fact that GLPs, plastic surgery, all of that could be part of that person's plan long term for them. So I think there's a space where it's not about just accept your body as it is, but I think it's this nuanced process of how do you go about figuring out what for you truly could be an uncomfortable experience versus what is kind of like fine for you. And I think that's part of what the GLP conversation could allow is like talking about your own discomfort, talking about your health issues, talking about potentially why you're like making this choice and not the other choice. And I think it opens up a beautiful opportunity to have some of those conversations that you wouldn't have, just on a daily basis.
I think that's fair. Again, just bearing in mind like your role as the parent and the boundaries that are appropriate to have in that conversation. I think that there's like you mentioned sort of love your body, body positivity versus body acceptance. I think that those are two equally viable paths, which is not which is not to say that there is like a right and a wrong, or that everybody should be pursuing body positivity, or that only body acceptance is realistic. Like I think those are individual journeys that people are on, and there is a way I think to accept our bodies and ourselves for our whole being and for all of our imperfections. And there are ways that we can try to feel better, and try to, sort of feel more positively. And we may bounce back and forth between those two things. But I think that's also an important message of like, how do we sit with discomfort in general and in ourselves?
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you pointed out the difference because I do think that, GLPs, that's a journey. If you had some sort of like lap band procedure, that's also a journey. And there's like just different indicators for all of it. But I think being able to talk about that with your teenager is going to be really important because like you said, they're going to notice, and I think like my next point for this would really be, if you're an adult on a GLP, talking with a therapist who really understands that journey because there are considerations for your health that you're going to want to like take into account, and then also prioritizing how your family views food and kind of what the food system is like. So for instance, if you're on a GLP, we know one of the side effects is reduced appetite. And the thing that can be really complicated is that if you're someone who's on a GLP and you're like, well, I'm only going to eat breakfast, what's the likelihood that you're actually eating breakfast with your teenager? You're at school, you're at work, right? They may not be present for that meal. And so then you have to consider like, oh, my teenager might not actually be seeing me eat. So is that something where you actually want to be more planful around like what meal do I consistently eat with my teenager as a family? Because if you're not eating dinner, but dinner is the family meal, are you inadvertently removing yourself from that because you've refocused and are eating breakfast instead of something else?
Which not only has implications for the meal and for the nutrition, but also for like the connection and the family ritual, right? Which is, of course, what we as clinicians and as sort of developmental people sort of know is also important. Because, one of the things that is most important, because again, if you remember, right, I am coming to you as an adolescent person and also as like, sort of an eating disorder clinician. And so I am always like, I sort of have this lens of thinking about how do we prevent the development of eating disorders. And of course, a big part of how we prevent eating disorders is less focus on, less talk about food and bodies, right? And more sort of flexible eating. But underneath that is helping our kids to feel like they matter not for what they look like, but for what's on the inside. And, really helping them feel loved and seen and noticed. And if the sort of food behaviors are changing, the family rituals are changing, we want to make sure that our kids still feel like noticed and appreciated and valued and like they matter, because that just is really important.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a piece like, GLPs obviously have like some side effects that, hopefully doctors are talking about with their patients and like, you're aware of if you're taking it. And I think that's a piece when we're talking about, family time and like food and dinner and meals and grocery shopping trips. Like there's a lot of things like we as much as we are also ingrained in the GLPs, like we're also very much a food centric society, right? And so I think when we're talking about starting GLPs and the side effects of that, there are a lot of routines that are likely going to be shifting. And I think like to your point about making sure that teens are like seen and supported and included and collaborated with, I think that's another piece where we can talk about the dinner structure and how that might shift a little bit. We can talk about how there might be new routines being added in, right? Like more walking. There might be like a gym exercise thing that's going to be kind of added in. And transitions can be challenging for families because obviously we are creatures of habit. We want things to stay the same. And I think that's part of why it's important to have this discussion about like, hey, like things might shift a little bit. And like, I want to have that conversation as an open conversation so you're included in this. But that may not change my choice as a parent to take a GLP. It's just that I want to take you in consideration in all the changes that are happening.
The thing that I'm thinking about and struggling with is sort of how do we, and I don't know if we can, but like, how do we hold this dialectic again of like, as parents, we are independent and we are allowed to make our own health and body choices. And whether we like it or not, it does impact our kids and our teenagers. And and again, to say like I don't know what the right answer is and I don't know what the right words to use are, but the thing that I worry about is that there is this like I'm thinking of like the helix, like there is this sort of intertwining of identity between a child or a teen and their parent. And so I heard the statistic the other day that like up until age 8 or 10, like a child really sees their body as like connected to their parent's body, and that it's not until that stage of like early latency where they can kind of separate themselves. And then of course in the teenage years there's this like push pull, right, of like, am I like my parent, am I not like my parent, I want to be, I don't want to be. And there's sort of this back and forth thing happening, and how do I define myself for who I am that's both separate from and connected to my parent. And I'm like just thinking about that and what that means for all of these conversations around body.
I do think it's also totally okay to like acknowledge that about like how gray and how messy and how complicated some of these things are, and how like as a parent, even as a provider, right, if you're working with a teenager and like a parent is on a GLP, is like we're going to continue to have these conversations, right? And this isn't just a one and done conversation. It's like something that is open indefinitely, so that way we're really having layered discussions that are allowing for additional questions and thoughts and feedback. And I know I'm very much the person, I've had one conversation and a week later I'm like, I have all these other thoughts and feelings about this situation at this point that I have come to conclude, and I would want to reopen that. And so I think, like, it is messy. It is gray. There's lots of different things that are in that pot. And I think it's one of the pieces about being able to be like, I'm here to talk about it.
Well, that's a really important point, right? And not only am I here to talk about it, but you're allowed to have your own feelings and your own reaction and your questions, and I can answer those as best I can, right? But that maybe that's about being sort of authentically present as a parent, which is really hard, especially when we are talking about something that is like, resting on some of your own issues or challenges or struggles or something that you feel sensitive about or vulnerable around, right? But being able to recognize that, look, my kid might have a reaction to this, which is not an easy one, or not the one I expected, or not the one I wanted, or not the one that, makes things smooth around the dinner table. And that has to be okay too.
It does. It does. I mean, I think as, providers that work with teens, I absolutely get that. I had a similar situation where I had a teenager whose parents got a new car and she was absolutely livid. At one point, because she's like, well, I wanted this other one and they said no. I think that it is so common for us to get defensive and to be like, well, I can make this decision because I'm an adult. And, we kind of like, we lead with that sometimes as a society instead of being like, tell me more about how that was like for you.
Such an important point, because that makes me think like the situation in my family was not a like, so you just don't know what the feelings are that it brings up. For us it was, I'm sad to let that one go, right? Not, I don't agree with your choice. And so, but you would never know that, like, if you didn't pause and sort of ask the question of, like, what's going on here? Or, I noticed that you have a lot of feelings about it. And that's what's ultimately the most important, right? Is that we are allowing and sort of encouraging our kids to have their own feelings and reactions, and empowering them to figure out how to make their own choices and how to deal with those feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like, weight and health and physical appearance has been something that has been so ingrained in us since like the 80s and the 90s that, like, we are 50 years into a society that is absolutely preoccupied with like thinness and skinniness. And so I know that it can be a very vulnerable conversation to have around like your body and like the choices you're making for it. And I think that that is likely part of the defensiveness that we sometimes see, where parents are like, well, I can make this decision. And it's like, yeah, you can. And we're not really debating that. But it's like being able to lead with curiosity, I think, is going to be much more important. And like, at the end of the day, as a parent, as a, an adult, you don't have to defend your choice. And your kid may not accept it at first, right? Like, there might be a lot of like heated conversations about how you're a hypocrite and how could you do this? And, okay, if you're going to get a tummy tuck, I want a nose job. And those are all things that are going to come up. So I think it's, in having this conversation, there is a certain point of like you're opening Pandora's box of all these things that could come out of it. But I do think sticking with the journey and continuing to be curious and have those conversations is gonna not just like offer really great opportunities, but it's going to help deepen the relationship you have and the understanding you have of each other in teenhood, and hopefully give them some great scaffolding for how they would make that decision or how they would come to certain conclusions for themselves.
I think that was really well said, and really important, that piece that you just made about hopefully deepening the relationship, right? And it speaks to like the really hard parts of parenting, which is balancing your own self and your needs and your circumstances with caring for somebody else, and also prioritizing their well-being, and staying grounded and like calm and regulated as you are having these difficult conversations, and not always having the answers. I mean, as so many of the things that you just said, really, just no matter what the topic is, it really speaks to how hard it is sometimes to have rules, have parameters, provide, containment and structure and consequences and do that in an empathic way. And look, it's really hard. And yet, I think you and I have both acknowledged so many times, like it's so important and it's so valuable and meaningful because teens are they're in this place where like they're taking so much in and they have so much like potential and capacity and like there's so many like neurons that are firing and just it's really like a brain and a person that is under development. And again, we don't have to be perfect, we don't have to do everything right all the time, but I think the more authentic in a developmentally appropriate way we can be, the better.
Yeah. I was actually just having this thought earlier this week is that it's not about perfection, right? Like I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, parents aren't perfect, the world is a freaking mess right now, definitely not perfect. It's really about effort and intention. Right. So if you're putting the effort forward to have these conversations, even if they don't have a good reaction at first, right? Like I have so much hope and faith in teens as like a population because I feel like maybe they're going to have an expressive reaction and it's going to be really hard for them, but likely they're going to come back and want to have that conversation and they're going to think about it and they're really going to ponder some of that and like that's a part where it's like they may explode at you and then you need to be ready to come back and have that conversation when they bring it up or when something happens, because again like that's the effort. I think that's the parenting journey is like just the layers upon layers that happen and
Yes, and that reminds me, right, that like no, I mean these interactions, whatever our version of like perfect is, right? Like that's not how real life works. That's not how relationships work. We're all learning and growing and changing, and we do things and we say things, and sometimes it's great and sometimes it's not, and then we come back. It's messy, and that's sort of the message of this topic and this like weight and body is like it's messy and there's no right answer and we have to be willing to acknowledge that and be able to like sit with that.
I often think about it as like the great untangling because sometimes when we're having conversations and I'm just like, oh yeah, that's connected to this and then that's connected to that and then that's connected to this giant knot. And like I think that one thing really try hard to impart on with parents is that like this is a giant knot that we're pulling from and sometimes we're not always entirely aware of what's connected to what, but like there is so much benefit in going through that process of truly understanding what's connected to what and how we're going to manage this and how we want to communicate about it. And I think that like even as part of the parenting journey, like that is something that's committed to like self-development and growth, right? Is your identity as a parent, how you're having these conversations, how you're helping to support your own untangling and like the untangling of, like something with your teen. And it can be so frustrating and so beautiful at the same time. And I feel like you're investing the short-term work and effort for those long-term gains, which sometimes I know it's hard to see. Where could this be in 5 years?
That was so beautifully said. I love that metaphor, that analogy of the great untangling, and it just reminds me of like again these protective factors and what it is that we're building here, which I fundamentally believe is the sort of connectedness, right? Especially in this world where there's all these quick fixes, there's all these messages about what we're supposed to look like and what we're not supposed to look like, and and we're seeing the explosion of like social media and AI and like all of this sort of disconnecting. And I think what is so meaningful and so important are these ideas about connectedness and authenticity and like really sort of seeing and mattering. I think those are the things we come back to. So somehow we started with GLP-1s and we ended up talking about just sort of parent-teen relationships, but I guess that's the part.
I think that's the thing. Like, I think there's a lot of parents, especially with GLPs, with how sensitive teens can be with body image and stuff. I think there is this leaning towards like, well, I just don't want to tell them, right? I don't want to have that conversation. I don't want to share. Like, that's really the piece, is that connectedness, that collaboration, and like taking them into consideration too. Is that somebody is watching, somebody is paying attention, someone has questions. And I think it's a beautiful space to be able to open up and have that and not be afraid of it, not feel like you have to defend yourself. Is like, well, this is my decision and this is why, and I think with the teen space, it's like they want to be heard, they want to be understood, they want to have a narrative. And I think like, it's healthier and safer for them to get a narrative from you about why you're engaging in like taking GLPs than it is for them to Google, right? And to look at it sometimes themselves, because we know AI isn't always 100% accurate. We know the information they're getting from their friends isn't always 100% accurate. And so if you're in a space to have that, or, engaging in therapy, they can help you with having some of those conversations too. But it's just going to promote, I think, a deeper depth of connection and conversation and teen belongingness, right? Like, it's because it's a huge deal for them too, right? Like, they might have known you one way for a really long time, and now all of a sudden you've dropped 40 pounds and you're not eating anything that you used to eat before that like maybe you were connected with. And so I think that's a piece where it's like, it may be your decision, but it's not free of outcomes and potential consequences on your teen's life. This, again, it's complicated, it's messy. I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation with me today, because again, it's not all black and white. We're not medical doctors, right? We don't know your specific case, but I think like I'm hoping people got some really great information on just like how to think about it and how to consider, having those conversations. And
I hope so too. I mean, I think that these medications are here, and they seem to be sort of influencing lots of people in lots of different ways. And sometimes I'd like to bury my head in the sand and ignore some of the things that are happening, but that's generally not the the most effective coping strategies. So, I think the more that we can talk about these things and help people to think and to understand not only how like their own decision making, but how that impacts teens around them, because teens have their whole life ahead of them, and so it's important that we're thoughtful.
yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for hanging in there with me with
Thank
the
you.
messy and the
Thank you
gray.
for having me. As always, it's always lovely to connect with you. So thank you.
Yes, of course. Well, everybody listening, if you have questions, if you have more comments, I'd love to hear them below. Certainly this is just kind of the start of some of these conversations. I imagine that there's probably 70 million hours we could spend talking about this type of stuff. But if you have other questions, other things that you'd like us to talk about at some point in the future, I'd love to have you drop them below. Again, if you're listening, I will drop all of Emily's contact information below if you want to reach out and connect for therapy, for support, consultation, etc. She's a wealth of information and resource, so I'm always glad to have you on the show.
Love being here, as are you.
Well, we love having you. So,
Thank you.
of course. Well, I'll let you go. Have a happy Friday, everybody who's listening. And again, like, check out everything below, and we're happy to help you through this journey. So have a good weekend.